It's another hot and balmy evening this evening in Johannesburg. The temperatures are rising once again and will be in the 30 degrees centigrade on the weekend. And a big welcome to everyone watching us this evening in South Africa, in Israel, in the United States, Canada, Panama, Argentina, and around the world. We've got a remarkable broadcast for you this evening. We'll be speaking to two international experts. First of all, we'll be talking to Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, a man who knows more about fighting terrorism than almost anyone in the entire world. And we're also delighted that this evening we are joined by David Benjamin, former legal advisor to the Israel Defense Forces, an international expert on what is permitted and not permitted when it comes to warfare. So a big welcome to everyone who's watching us this evening. On controls this evening is Dylan Berger. Dylan, you can turn on your camera and say hello to everyone. We'll be broadcasting this evening across multiple channels. We'll be broadcasting on Zoom, on YouTube, and on Facebook. Dylan, you're on controls this evening. How are you doing?
Yeah, good evening, Howard. Nice to see you again. It's nice to have a webinar. It's been a while. So it's good to be back on controls and you in the hot seat again.
It's been a while, but of course we had Jewish Achiever Awards and we did a number of broadcasts for Jewish Achiever Awards. Watched now in excess of 40,000 people having watched Jewish Achiever Awards. So it's very nice after a little break to be back. But of course, the topic is never a nice topic. We're talking about war. And in war, people die and people get injured. And none of this is very pleasant at all. But it's been an enormously traumatic, I think, 8 weeks now? And it's time we start talking about the strategy and the tactics of war, and that's what we're going to be doing this evening. So we're going live at 8 p.m. We often do pre-chat just before we go live. But Dylan, I thought that we would show a video this evening in 10 minutes before we go live. Yuval Harari is probably one of the greatest thinkers and minds of our generation. So he recently was on a program talking about warfare, because he was the person who told us mere 4 years ago, he told us three things. Said there are three problems that the world has faced throughout its existence: warfare, famine, and disease. And he told us we had solved all three of them. And 4 years later, having gone through a period of COVID, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Hamas's invasion of Israel, looks like that warfare isn't over either. And it also looks like poverty and hunger still plague the world as well. So was Yuval Noah Harari, the greatest mind of our generation, wrong? Or are we looking at things through a very different perspective? So I thought, just in the lead up, as people join us across YouTube, on Zoom, and on Facebook, in the lead up, thought I'd just play everyone 10 minutes of Yuval Harari. It's off a German broadcast, so you will see that some of the subtitles are in German. But we'll be back just a minute or two before 8 o'clock, and we'll start our webinar then. But if you haven't seen this, certainly worthwhile watching. So I'm going to turn off cameras, go on mute for a minute or two, and play you Yuval Noah.
The number of escalating conflicts worldwide is increasing.
Militärputsch in Myanmar.
Der russische Angriffskrieg gegen die Ukraine.
Im Sudan.
Im westafrikanischen Niger.
Au régime en place.
Aserbaidschan.
Wir befinden uns im Krieg, nicht in einer Operation, nicht im Gefecht, im Krieg.
Even though 10 years ago the Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari wrote, "Never before has peace been so prevalent that people could not even imagine war."
In the early 21st century, largely thanks to the global liberal order, humanity has experienced the most peaceful and prosperous era in history. That era is now over.
So, what changed since then? Ukraine, Sudan, Israel. Experts say we are witnessing a cascade of wars. The number of war casualties worldwide is increasing.
We all feel pain. We all love our children, our spouses, our parents. So instead of fighting each other, we should work towards our shared interests. This was the simple idea behind the global liberal order.
Okay, stop. Global liberal order. What's that? After the Second World War, the US set up a complex system of alliances and institutions. The US, as the by far strongest military and economy, safeguards global stability.
One unshakable unity of determination to find a way to end war.
Member states commit to universal and liberal values. They cooperate in promoting human rights, in free trade, and they stop fighting wars of conquest.
Indeed, our international order has been so successful that we take it as a given that great powers no longer fight world wars.
The global liberal order was far from perfect, had many problems. And this order was attacked and destroyed. And when there is no order, what you get is disorder, chaos, violence, and it's spreading.
The system isn't working anymore. But why? Two theories about that are all over the scientific debate: populism and polarity. The theory of polarity explains how many countries are powerful enough to influence world politics to their own desires. In a multipolar system, 3 or more countries are trying to achieve just that. On their own, they are in balance. Alliances can plunge the system into chaos. The consequence? The 30 Years' War, the 9 Years' War, the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II. In a bipolar system, 2 more or less equally powerful countries are facing each other, as during the Cold War. In theory, it's the most stable system. In reality, though, the bipolar order led to a whole array of proxy wars, as in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. Since the end of the Cold War, the US were the sole superpower in a unipolar system. Which brings us back to the present and the global liberal order. But, according to experts, this order has 3 fatal flaws. The invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan proved that not even the US military might can enforce sustainable regime change. Growing parts of the populations in Western democracies reacted with nationalism to refugees from North Africa and the Middle East. And the consequences of a globalized economy. While China rose, the US and Europe saw increasing job losses and income inequality. All 3 led to a rise in populism. How exactly does populism attack the world order?
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
It's always about a strong leader who supposedly has to protect the nation from outsiders. To do so, civil society, the justice system and media need to be restricted.
We have been ruled for close to 14 years by a populist strongman, Benjamin Netanyahu, who built his career on dividing the nation against itself. If you vote for populist strongmen to divide society and dismantle the state, this is the danger. That when you need the state most, they will no longer be there.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, from the Trans-Pacific Partnership,
from the UN Human Rights Council.
In the mind of populists, any global cooperation is almost like treason.
Alright, we got the theories, but how does that explain the wars? The US are still the economic, technological and military powerhouse of the world. But are they still an uncontested unipolar power?
Multipolare Welt.
Multipolar. Many think we've already been living in a less stable, multipolar world for a long time. The trade influence of the EU, China's great power ambition, the potential of India's population, but also climate change and migration might be counted as a pole nowadays.
We are definitely for many years no longer in a unipolar world. In some respects, the rise of new powers is not a bad thing. It's good if a new powers like India, like Brazil, receive a greater say about world affairs. Now, if you have some alternative idea, you don't like the liberal order, you don't like liberal values, but you do have some alternative set of values and norms that is not true only for your country, that can serve as universal values for the whole human community, okay, let's hear the alternative. But simply to attack the universal liberal values and institutions without replacing them with anything, this is a recipe for a global disaster.
Some argue that the Trump style of populism has shifted the attention of the US from a global to an inward focus. Further, that the war in Ukraine has distracted the United States from preventing other conflicts. And third, the increasing violence from states like Azerbaijan, militaries in the Sahel region, or from the Hamas terrorists would show that they don't fear the US military might no more.
We are sliding back to the jungle. The global liberal order is in disarray, if not in collapse. It is replaced by chaos and violence.
The international system is showing fragmentation. Free trade deals fail. Autocrats like Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan impede unity in NATO.
Ve Hamas bir terör örgütü değil, topraklarını ve vatandaşlarını koruma mücadelesi.
In the UN General Assembly, actual allies are not voting alongside each other anymore. Worldwide, indexes for globalization, free trade and democratization are stagnating or falling. The global liberal order seems to be less and less global, liberal and orderly.
We control this planet not because individually we are so smart or so good, but because we know how to cooperate better than any other entity on the planet, better than chimpanzees or better than viruses. This is our secret of success. If we forget it on the level of a nation or on the level of the entire species, and fall into more and more internal and international conflicts, it's not just, the regional wars in the Middle East. It's the threat of a third world war. It's climate change and ecological collapse. It's the rise of disruptive technologies like artificial intelligence. We need global cooperation on that. If we cannot do that, then humanity has very little chance of surviving the challenges of the 21st century.
Thank you.
Those were the views of Yuval Noah Harari, probably the greatest public intellectual of our time. We're going to go live in exactly 2 minutes' time. And before we do that, a big welcome to our two guests this evening, Colonel Richard Kemp and David Benjamin. Let's unmute you, let's hear you, and tell us where you're joining us from. Richard, do I have to be differential? Are you Colonel or Richard this evening?
You got to call me sir, I'm afraid. That's all I accept. I get called a lot worse things than either Colonel or Richard, but my name's Richard, but I'm joining you tonight from Israel, from Tel Aviv at the moment.
Fantastic. A big welcome to you. And David Benjamin, I see you have a boat behind you. Are you next to the ocean?
No, that's just a longing for distant oceans. I'm in Modi'in, not too far from the ocean. Wherever you are in Israel, you're close to the beach, I suppose.
So you're about 15 minutes away from Richard, and it's been a tough day to be in that side of the world. There were a number of terrorist attacks today in Jerusalem. Richard, did you experience any of that or get affected by that at all?
No, not this time. I wasn't in Jerusalem today. I was in Jerusalem yesterday, but I think everyone is affected in this country by something like that, particularly at a time when the country is effectively at war. And as I understand it, these were Hamas terrorists that carried out the attack. Don't take that as gospel, but that's the information I received.
And David, on your side, you're joining us this evening. You're an expert in international law, and particularly international law as it affects the laws of war.
Correct. At least I like to think so. But, yeah.
Well, we have many questions to pose to you this evening about the laws of war and what is permissible and what's not permissible. But the time has just gone 8 p.m. South Africa time. And a huge welcome to everyone who's watching us around the world. We have very big audiences this evening in Israel, in the United Kingdom, in places like the United States, in Canada, and all over Africa, in places like Argentina, Panama, UAE. People are watching us this evening. So a big welcome to all of you who are joining us for our 163rd broadcast that we've done as part of this JR Live series. We're enormously grateful to have two international experts this evening and two towering figures who are joining us this evening. But before we begin, just a very quick reminder. On controls this evening is Dylan Berger. Dylan, a big welcome to you. Thank you so much for doing this evening. Let's quickly tell people what's in the Jewish Report newspaper this week. So please go. We distribute free of charge in about 242 locations around South Africa. And you can go and pick up your hard copy of the Jewish Report newspaper. On the front cover, you will see freed South African hostages grapple with reality back home. There were a number of South Africans killed on the 7th of October in Israel. There were 2 South Africans taken hostage, and we're enormously grateful that both of the South Africans taken hostage have now been freed. And shall we say, we're freed without the intervention of South Africa's Department of International Relations and Cooperation, who showed absolutely no interest whatsoever in trying to get the hostages freed from Hamas. So please go to your local Spar, your Checkers, your Pick and Pay, your supermarket, your butchery, your school, pick up a hard copy of the South African Jewish Report newspaper, obviously free of charge. There is one additional edition that's coming out next week, which will be the final edition of the year before we take a December festive season break. If you can't get your hands on a hard copy of the newspaper, please remember there are about 36,000 people that get our digital copy, our newsletter, and you can go onto our website at any point in time. There are about 80,000 unique users every month who go onto our website every month and download either the entire edition or look at the individual articles themselves online. So you can be one of them. The address is www.sajr, which obviously stands for South African Jewish Report. So sajr.co.za. And if you would like to refer this webinar or any of our previous 162 webinars that we've done to anyone, there is a link on our website. You will see Dylan has put it on. Just click on the webinar tab and you'll be able to see all our previous webinars, or you can go onto YouTube, onto the SA Jewish Report YouTube channel and see it then. So as we're doing this, I see people are telling us where in the world that they are, and we have people joining us. If I can just tell our guests, we have people joining us from Modi'in in Israel. Hello, Raylene. We've got people in San Diego. We have people in Cape Town. A lot of people, it looks like, are joining us in Cape Town, in London, in Auckland, New Zealand, Collins in South Africa. We have Grev in the Winelands, people in Cape Town, Netanya in Israel, Herzliya, people in New Jersey, Cornwall in the UK, people joining us around the world. So if you have a moment and you are watching us on YouTube, on Zoom, or on Facebook, please just take a moment and tell our guests where exactly you're tuning in from, so we know where our audience is this evening. And I see we have people in Radlett in UK and more people in New York busy watching us. So big welcome. Colonel Kemp, can we start with you? How do you become a colonel? Give us a few moments and a sense and a flavor of what it takes to become commander of the British forces in Afghanistan. Run us through a few highlights of your career, and what does it mean to you to be a military man?
Well, to get promotion, like everywhere, you've got to say the right thing to the right people and bring an apple in for the teacher and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I left high school one day, joined the army the next. And I spent most of my career on operations fighting against the kind of terrorism that Israel is fighting against today, and that included about 7 operational tours of duty in Northern Ireland, where we fought a 30-year terror campaign there, And incidentally, the IRA and Palestinian terrorists frequently cooperated with each other in the past. And indeed, the remnants of the IRA today are vocally supporting Hamas in their terrorist attacks. And I'm talking about speaking, not necessarily participating. And I also fought in Afghanistan and in Iraq, in the Balkans, and pretty much everywhere the British Army served in. I didn't get to go to the Falkland Islands, unfortunately. I'd hoped to take part in that war, but I wasn't selected, so I missed out on that. I spent my last few years of my military service, about the last 5 or 6 years, working in the Prime Minister's office in the UK. And my role then was on international terrorism intelligence. And I worked for the COBRA Crisis Management Committee, which is kind of similar to the White House Situation Room in the UK, in the US. And in that time in particular, I became fairly closely associated with Israel and the Israeli government. I worked closely with the Mossad station in London, as well as with other national intelligence services such as the CIA. And I developed a very strong understanding, I think, of the IDF, how Israel fights and the challenges it faces. And since then, since I left the forces in particular, I've visited Israel very frequently, and I've been present for pretty much every Gaza conflict that's occurred over here. So I consider myself, I can use my my military experience of this type of operations, plus my knowledge of the IDF, to try and shed some light on the situation that's going on today, which obviously is only too often is misrepresented and lied about in so much of our media, as well as in places like the United Nations, the EU, and other international bodies. I've been to South Africa a few times, so I'm happy to say it was a great pleasure to do so. Looking forward, I haven't got another visit on my schedule, but looking forward at some point to return to meet the wonderful, particularly the wonderful Jewish community in South Africa, who I got to know pretty well.
So, Colonel, give us a sense, because you were in Afghanistan, you were in Iraq, and you were fighting insurgencies in those theaters of operation. What is it like? Give us a sense if you're a soldier in that sort of environment. You know, for those of us who are far away from the conflict and have never had military careers, is it terrifying to be in that sort of environment? Or is a soldier's job well-trained, go do what you have to do, keep your head down and go ahead? What is it like to actually be an army officer in the field?
Yeah, I think you're very well trained to deal with these situations, and when you're in the face of it, you don't have time, I don't think, to be frightened or terrified. Particularly if you're an officer commanding troops, you've got too much else to worry about. You know, in kind of emotional terms, at least, the dangers that you face, because like the IDF in Gaza, British Army in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Northern Ireland and elsewhere, the threat was constant, and it was from every direction. It's not like maybe a more conventional battlefield such as Ukraine, for example. And I was in Ukraine myself just before I came out here. I've been there a few times during the conflict, and that like the Second World War and other conventional wars, is a more linear conflict. The dangers, you know where the dangers are. You know who the enemy is because he's in uniform. Whereas, of course, in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Gaza, you're facing people who are dressed as civilians, who are among the civilian population, and who it's very hard, unless they're actually shooting at you or carrying a gun, it's very hard to identify who the bad guys are from the, shall we say, not bad guys, not so bad guys. Because in most of these theaters, whether it's Gaza or Afghanistan, a lot of the local people do actually support the jihadists, the insurgents that are fighting against you. And they give them protection, they give them cover, they conceal them whenever necessary. But I think a common trait, there's a major difference between Gaza and, say, Afghanistan, and that is Gaza is a very small area. The IDF have unrivaled intelligence on the details of Gaza, who's where, what the where the enemy keeps its weapons, how the enemy operates, all of this, which allows them, I think, to be extremely good at differentiating between the civilian and the fighters. and being able to warn civilians. And I've always been astonished in a way to learn, as I've learned many times, that the IDF will make a phone call to people in residential apartment blocks that terrorists are present in and tell them that they're about to carry out an attack, warn them to get out, warn them, and then watch them get out before they actually carry out the strike. That sort of extreme care, which the IDF is known for by everybody who is prepared to listen to the truth, is something you can't achieve in a country like Afghanistan, where such vast areas, you tend to go in maybe to a certain area for a short time. You can't really get to know it very well. So that's one of the major differences. Commonalities are, I think, above all, that terrorists in Iraq, Afghanistan, Northern Ireland, anywhere that terrorists operate, they deliberately hide among the civilian population. They use them as human shields. In the case of Gaza in particular, they want the IDF to kill their civilians in order to be able to delegitimize Israel, to attract global vilification, isolation, and hatred against Israel, which they do very successfully. And they're, of course, more than happy and enthusiastic to use protected locations that are protected under international law, like schools, hospitals, mosques, etc., for fighting from and for storing weapons in, for acting as command centers. And that, of course, adds a layer of problems for the IDF, as it does for us when they use in other countries when they use that, which is that the world just sees a hospital. They don't see what's going on around the hospital, and only too often they don't believe it when the IDF says we've got to attack this location because it is a military objective. And of course, under international law, if a place like that, a protected location, is used for military purposes, then subject to the obvious constraints of international law, those objectives can lawfully be attacked.
So, Colonel, let's maybe start at the beginning. And the beginning is 7th of October. Were you surprised at the enormous success that Hamas had on the 7th of October? They breached the international border in 22 different locations. They targeted 30 villages and kibbutzim and army bases and a music festival. They killed about 1,200 people, primarily civilians. They injured in excess of 5,000 people, and they kidnapped over 240 people. In my mind, that seems like an extraordinary feat. Could Hamas, in their own planning, have ever anticipated how successful they were going to be on that day?
I've been here since a couple of days after the 7th of October in Israel. And in that time, I visited Kfar Aza, one of the communities that was most heavily attacked, and also Sderot. And I've also watched the 45-minute video that the IDF put together to show to selected audience, particularly journalists and politicians. And I've seen, therefore, the immediate aftermath of what they did firsthand. It was absolutely devastating to see it and to watch the videos. And one thing that I think is notable about the video that I saw, there was two things really struck me. One was that I hesitate to use the term, but I think it is relevant, the professionalism and the skill of these terrorists. It wasn't like terrorists I've been operating before. These were well-trained, well-organized, well-drilled. They were operating as teams. They were communicating with each other. They were acting like soldiers, like conventional soldiers in a way. And that, to me, very clearly says these are not some ragtag terrorist bunch from Gaza. That's, of course, where they come from, but they've been trained by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps from Iran, probably by Hezbollah as well. They've been trained. It has the hallmarks of the IRGC all over it. The second thing that struck me about it was the pure pleasure and joy that these terrorists were experiencing, butchering Jewish people and in some cases non-Jews, including murdering them, beheading them, raping them, burning them alive, and dragging some off into captivity. And that, frankly, although it was quite striking to see the pleasure that they got from it, but what they did was not a surprise at all. It was in no way surprising that they would behave in this way. This is characteristic of Hamas, and it's characteristic of jihadists like Islamic State and Taliban, Al-Qaeda, everywhere. This is the way they behave. It's alien to us, but it certainly isn't alien to them. In terms of was I surprised at the success and the extent of the attack, yes, I was. I think there were three very clear failures which allowed Hamas to achieve what they achieved, dreadful though it was. One was a failure of intelligence. Everyone knows about that. It will obviously be investigated and pored over as it should be in the future. Secondly, a failure of defense, because even if you do believe that, as I think the IDF did believe and the Israeli intelligence did believe, that Hamas does not have an immediate interest in attacking Israel, even if you believe that, but you know they've got the capability, then it's your duty to defend against that. And it wasn't done effectively. And thirdly, I think, was a failure of reaction. And it took the IDF a long time to actually deploy formed forces to come and react to the terrorists. When they did it with devastating effectiveness. I would, however, like to pay tribute to all of those people, whether they were civilians, off-duty soldiers, police officers, intelligence officers, who in many cases just came south. They, as we would describe it, they marched to the sound of the guns. They came south to help, and there was some incredible bravery shown by people from retired generals down to private soldiers who came to the fight. And I think that certainly should not be underestimated. Unfortunately, many of them died. But overall, it was a very significant failure for Israel, unfortunately, and a far greater success, I think, than Hamas could ever have expected to achieve on that day.
So one of the things that was relatively unique about this attack as well is that we saw grotesque brutality. We saw beheadings, we saw people burnt alive, we saw heads chopped off, we saw a pregnant woman being disemboweled and the babies dragged off, baby's head cut off. We saw all of that, and yet Hamas filmed it. They filmed it with their own cameras. They wore body cam, and the body cam footage has been removed from the Hamas dead. So there's evidence of probably one of the greatest war crimes ever recorded.
Yeah, and this is something actually that is not a new development. This is something that the Islamic State excelled at. They made sure they filmed what they were doing, burning people alive in cages, for example, beheading people, other atrocities. They filmed it and got it out there on the internet. They wanted people to know what they'd done. They wanted to inspire other people. Grotesque though it sounds to any civilized person, they knew that it would have traction among certain elements of their own communities and jihadist communities around the world. And it's kind of in striking contrast. I'm not in any way trying to suggest that in any way that the Nazis were decent people. They certainly were not. We know that. It doesn't need me to say it. But they made sure they did not film their atrocities if they could possibly avoid it. There were some people who disobeyed the orders and did take some photographs, but by and large, they wanted to keep it secret. Not so for jihadists. They want people to know about it. And the really troubling thing is that a lot of people, a lot of jihadists around the world and their supporters have celebrated this footage. They're kind of showing respect to Hamas for doing what they did. And Hamas knew this would be the case. So it's part, the whole thing is part of their terror campaign. It's first of all intending to promote and get recruits to jihad, but secondly, it's to put fear and terror into their enemies, not just in Israel, but around the world.
So given the fact that Hamas probably never anticipated how successful they would have been, is it that at the same time, they never anticipated the veracity of the response that they would receive back based on the success that they achieved on the 7th of October?
I don't know is the answer to that. I would think so. I should think they probably expected a limited campaign in response to maybe a limited attack, which they probably expected. I would imagine they expected a limited campaign by Israel. But I think everybody should be aware, if they're not, that Hamas fundamentally, their overall strategy, although their founding charter, which they adhere to today, says that they have to destroy the Jewish state. That's their mission. They know they can't do that by military force. They absolutely know it. So why did they do these attacks? Why did they carry out the attack on the 7th? Why have they carried out repeated rocket attacks? Why have they dug tunnels to attack Israel from underneath the border? there's one reason why they do it, and that is to attract Israeli retaliation, Israeli defensive action against them. And they know, because of the way they operate, that if that happens, civilians are going to die in Gaza. They know that, and it's unavoidable, unfortunately, but they know it. And they want those civilians to die. They want as many civilians to die as possible, which sounds bizarre. And they're the only army in the history of the world that I'm aware of, maybe there are other examples, which wanted their enemies to kill their own civilian population. Most armies exist to protect the civilians. They exist to see them killed. Why? Because when the IDF carries out operations against Hamas or other terrorists in Gaza, and there are several groups, and kill innocent civilians, despite all the measures the IDF take, and we know how extensive they are, then Hamas use that, and their supporters use it, to delegitimize Israel, to vilify Israel, to isolate Israel in international bodies, in university campuses, in governments, in the United Nations in particular. And that's the way they hope to get at Israel, to undermine Israel's existence in that way. And it works every time. It works very successfully. It's worked this time. We're seeing condemnation of Israel. We're seeing Israel accused of war crimes by people that don't even know what a war crime is. And we've seen it in the past. And the effect of every single UN, I've spoken at UN Human Rights Council debates on previous Israeli conflicts, and they always find, before the investigation begins, they found Israel guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And what that does is encourage Hamas to do it again and again and again. That is the real cycle of violence in the Middle East, is not a cycle of violence between Israel and Hamas, because Israel is not a participant. Israel is a respondent in that situation. Whereas the UN and other international bodies and other people who support Hamas and media organizations like the BBC, they are active participants in the cycle of violence, because they respond to Hamas's atrocities and to Israel's response to that in exactly the way that Hamas wants them to.
So, Colonel, we're going to come back in a few moments and talk about what should Israel do militarily, and ask you the question whether you were surprised that Israel was willing to put feet on the ground in a ground offensive in Gaza. But I have some questions for David Benjamin before we do that. But Dave, before I ask you my questions, I want to remind all the people watching us this evening on YouTube, on Zoom, and on Facebook that this is a conversation that involves everyone. So there's a chat and a Q&A section on Zoom. There's a chat section on YouTube and on Facebook. Please feel free to post any comments, any questions, and we'll make sure that those comments and questions are brought to our panel. And let's make sure we have a very broad discussion this evening. But Dave, you were former legal advisor to the Israel Defense Forces. And when something like this happens, October the 7th happens, the military probably has a process. How do we respond? What is a legitimate target? And how do you legally fight a terrorist organization that's often not dressed in uniform, that doesn't have military bases, that operates in civilian areas? Talk us through the process of the decision-making that happens in the IDF on how do you respond and what laws do you have to actually adhere to?
Thank you. Well, first of all, not the only legal advisor to the IDF, but one of them. Another thing I have to say is that what an honor it is to share a screen with Colonel Richard Kemp. He's a man of exceptional bravery, wisdom, and integrity. I have to say, my late father served in the British Army. Far from being a colonel, he was a lance corporal who eventually got demoted. But there's something in Colonel Kemp's demeanor and mannerisms that reminds me of my late father. My late father was a rabbi, and he had this talent of getting people in the shul not to make a noise. He had that authority that Colonel Kemp has. So I respect him for that. Colonel Kemp is what I would call, in the fullest sense of the word, an officer and a mensch. And so again, great honor to be with you, Colonel Kemp. I need to point out, yes, I was a legal advisor in the IDF for many years, originally South African, as you probably guessed already, if you don't know. What I'm doing now, I'm not in any way representing anyone. except myself, okay? Not the IDF, not the government, nothing. Okay, I'm just speaking for myself. Just need to make that clear before we go. Okay, so in answer more directly to your question, there's another general comment I want to make, and that is, when we talk about the laws of war, we have to make a very difficult leap, all right? This is a difficult leap for anyone with basic humanity, okay? Because the laws of war are very, very different to the laws of peacetime, okay? In war, things that we find completely abhorrent in peacetime become legal, okay? The most obvious example of that is that in war, it is legal to kill people under certain, obviously, with certain limitations. It's legal to destroy property. It's legal to deprive people of their freedom. Again, in peacetime, that's anathema. In war, it becomes legitimate. So we have to remember, we're making this giant leap into a world which is a terrible world. Okay, it's not the kind of world we want to see. Okay, and any normal person with humanity would be deeply troubled, okay, by the sights and the consequences of war. But remember, that's where we are, and so we have to kind of take a deep breath and just acknowledge that. So now let's talk about what the laws of war are. So the laws of war, first of all, you can find them in certain conventions, which are agreements between states. The most famous you've probably heard of, the Geneva Conventions, 4 Geneva Conventions, 1949, and also the protocols to the Geneva Conventions. There's an important concept which we call customary law, right? Not every country is signed on to every convention, but there are all sorts of principles which have become what we accepted generally as customary law, and those bind you whether you like it or not. Okay, that's the basic layout of the laws of war. Now, it's important to stress the laws of war have another name. They're also called international humanitarian law, or the laws of armed conflict. All right, it's the same thing. Not everyone gets that. It's different to what we call human rights law. Human rights law is centered on the rights that individuals have, generally speaking, in peacetime. Those are, for the most part, suspended in wartime, and a different system of law kicks in. That's international human rights law. International human rights law is not international humanitarian law. Sounds very similar. There's international human rights law, which is about individual rights that people have, and international humanitarian law, which is actually about obligations of parties to armed conflicts. It's actually a very different aspect. Now, in Israel, international humanitarian law is written into the standing orders and the modus operandi of the IDF. So when the IDF trains and prepares for any conflict, it does so in accordance with international humanitarian law. And it makes use of legal advisors like myself in order to do so. But the upshot of that is that any soldier or commander who receives an order from above in the IDF chain of command, that order, assuming everything's working correctly, will be in accordance with international humanitarian law. That's just the way the IDF works. I have to point out in parentheses that Israel can be a very confusing place because of our political system, the way things work, the fact that we're a very free country, people can express their opinions freely. There's not a lot of discipline even within the government about what people say. So you might hear a lot of bluster and all sorts of troubling statements by people where you think, hang on a sec, if Israel's going there, maybe there is a problem. Okay, what I'm here, to the best of my knowledge, is to assure you that the IDF is a professional body and it works according to international humanitarian law, by definition. That's the only way it knows how to work. So what does that mean, international humanitarian law? Well, first of all, there's the basic logic behind it is that wars can be fought. It may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but it's probably true. Wars can be fought causing a lot fewer casualties and destruction and injury than previous wars have known. Okay, obviously the great wars, World War I, World War II, which actually they spawned the development of international law, the Geneva Conventions, etc. Okay, the idea being that countries can fight each other, like all out in war, okay, and they can win the war, but without having to cause all kinds of harm, which were caused very, very dramatically in those wars. Okay, so an example would be harm to civilians. Okay, so in the theoretical case where two law-abiding countries go to war, let's take, I don't know, Australia versus Canada. Okay, I hope that's a completely hypothetical situation. But two ostensibly law-abiding countries, if they go to war, okay, they will be able to do so causing very little collateral damage. Collateral damage being the euphemism for civilian casualties and harm to civilian objects. Okay, because they will focus their attacks on military targets, okay, and keep civilians out of the way. When I say keep civilians out of the way, there's two sides to that. The one is that you, in your offensive operations, you only target military targets. That's a very, very important principle. And the other is in your defense, okay, you ensure that the civilians are well away from any of your military assets, so that even when you are attacked by an enemy, okay, your civilians won't be in danger. In fact, you're under a duty to do everything you can to protect your civilians. I can point out that in Israel, I mean, I don't think it needs a lot of explication, but Israel really does go out of its way to protect its own civilians. I can tell you now, for example, I live in Modi'in. It's not a place that suffers particularly from missile fire, but I have an app on my phone that rings every time a missile is coming towards me. If I'm in my car on the way, say to Tel Aviv, and a missile is coming, I'll get that warning on my phone, and I know that I need to take cover. Right? Every house here is built by law with a special fortified room or a bomb shelter where people can take shelter. So Israel really does go out of its way to ensure that all civilians are protected. And needless to say, any Israeli military asset that fires into Gaza or anything is far, far away from any civilian, so that even if there's counterfire, that won't endanger civilians. So that's the first most important principle. There's some other important principles, which, with your permission, now I'm on a roll, I'll go into.
Quickly, because we want to do lots of interaction, please.
Very quickly. Okay, so let me just mention two more. The one is that you take all feasible precautions to prevent harm to civilians. Okay, Colonel Kemp already outlined a great example of that is warning civilians in advance to the extent that you can. And Israel really has a very developed system of being able to do that. Yeah, it's not something you can take for granted. It's not something you're going to have in every theater of conflict. Obviously, you need everybody's cell phone numbers, right? That's not a trivial thing to have. Yeah, I'm not sure they had that in Afghanistan. Fortunately, we have it in Gaza. Yeah, obviously, we lack the intelligence very, very badly in other ways, but that's in that sense, we certainly have that ability. And that gives us the opportunity to be able to attack military targets of high military value and not harm civilians. When I say not harm civilians, of course, that depends on civilians cooperating. So if we evacuate civilians from a certain area, okay, they need to evacuate. And we know Hamas often tries to prevent people from evacuating for the very reasons that Colonel Kemp outlined, which serve their purpose, etc. But the idea is that you take precautions, all sorts of precautions. You use precise munitions. You time the attacks in such a way that they'll cause less civilian damage, etc. And another principle, which is really important, this one is perhaps causes the most confusion and it's thrown out all the time, is called proportionality, right? Attacks, military strikes have to be proportionate. What does that mean? Let's get this right. It's not about tit for tat. There's no quid pro quo principle. Okay, that's a myth. Okay, you need to put that aside. That's something from peacetime. It's not in wartime. In wartime, what does proportionality mean? It means that if you're going after a legitimate military target, you're allowed to attack a legitimate military target, something that you will achieve a military benefit by attacking it. You have to look at the anticipated harm to civilians, casualties or harm to civilian property or both. Okay, and the principle says that if that harm would be excessive in relation to the advantage, the military advantage of attacking the military target, then you must refrain from attacking. That means, if to paraphrase, that means you have to weigh up the value of the military target. You have to weigh up the damage, the potential damage to civilians. Okay, and if the potential damage to civilians is too high, then you may not attack. But what is implied there, and this is the most important thing to point out to people who are not familiar with the rules of war, and it's a difficult thing to stomach, but it's the truth. It means that in all sorts of circumstances, it is legitimate to attack a military target, even in the knowledge that it will cause harm to civilians. Okay, so you do everything you can, or you take all the precautions you can to avoid harm to civilians. But in certain circumstances, you may attack a military target, even when you know that civilians are likely to be harmed as a result. I'll leave it at that, but those are the important principles, the general guiding principles that need to be followed in a military conflict.
So Dave, just very quickly, before we go back to Colonel Kemp, we've seen, for example, Israel using knocking bombs. So they tap on the top of the building before they attack the building to give people time to evacuate. They drop leaflets telling people that your area is about to be attacked, please go. And we've seen this amazing thing of telephone calls, which we don't think we've seen anywhere else in the world, in order to tell people they need to get out of that area. What happens when people don't go? What happens when civilians just refuse to move?
Well, then you're left with the fallback position of whether the attack is proportionate or not. Okay, and it might be you're in a position where the attack is not proportionate. There are too many civilians. If the value of the target doesn't justify it, then you can't attack. Of course, that's a built-in advantage to an organization like Hamas. But Israel's method, especially the methodology of warning in advance and firing a warning missile in advance, is actually quite effective. It's quite persuasive. But unfortunately, it's not always the case. You know, we tried. When I say we, you know, the Israeli military tried to evacuate. I mean, it has succeeded eventually, but it gave people several weeks to evacuate from the northern area of Gaza in order to somehow, you know, in a sense, level the playing field, get the civilians out the way, and then being able to engage Hamas directly. Not so much directly because Hamas is mostly underground, but still that was the object of doing so. So yes, you're left with a test of proportionality, and there can be situations where you just can't attack, where a target will actually be immune to attack because of the potential damage to civilians that could take place.
So, Colonel, were you surprised that Israel in this instance didn't just attack from the air, but were willing to put hundreds of thousands of troops first on the border and then actually putting boots on the ground in Gaza? Did that come as a bit of a surprise to you? Because I'm told it surprised the American administration that Israel was willing to go that far.
I have to say, I'd have been very surprised after the 7th of October if Israel hadn't done that, because it is unfortunately simply not possible to eliminate the threat from Hamas just from the air. Back in 2014, we saw Israel going into Gaza before, and that was a limited operation to make predominantly focused on destroying tunnels. And I think it was inevitable that after what happened, you know, in my mind, the world changed on the 7th of October, just like the world changed on 9/11, except the 7th of October was a great deal worse than 9/11. If you look at comparative population ratios, it was something like the equivalent of 10 or 15 or more 9/11s in one day in Israel. So, you know, there was no option. There was no option for the Israeli government other than to initially launch an air campaign, which which eliminated a significant amount of Hamas capability and made life easier for the IDF going in on the ground later. That was a necessary precursor, 3-week air campaign. It also, as David said, it also gave time to get the civilian population, or as much of it as possible, out of northern Gaza down towards the south before the IDF went in on the ground. So the short answer to the question is no surprise whatsoever. And every country in the world faced with a situation like that would have done exactly what the Israelis did, except maybe not as effectively.
So talk us through military strategy. How does it work? Do the aircraft always go in first, bomb as much as they can, and then the army follows? How when you plan militarily for something like this, what is the process that you go through?
Well, it obviously depends totally on the situation, but just one comparison is the Gulf War in 1991, which I was involved with with US forces, with British allies and French and other Arab countries went in to effectively to liberate Kuwait from Iraq. And in that conflict, and of course, you know, many people will remember that in that conflict, Saddam Hussein fired Scud missiles into Israel in order to try and get Israel to join the fight. It was kind of a little bit like the Hamas strategy, get Israel into the fight, which would have the effect of breaking up the coalition, because many of the Arab countries, if not all of them, would have probably then left the coalition. But nevertheless, that campaign began with an air war. It was, I think it wasn't 3 weeks, it was something like 2 months, I think. I can't recall exactly. Something like 2 months of air war against the Iraqis. And the reason that you need to go in from the air first, if possible, it's not always possible, but if it is possible, is because you can establish air superiority or air supremacy, which means air supremacy means that the aircraft carrying out the attacks are at virtually no risk at all themselves. So they can do a lot of damage without any real possibility of damage to them. And that's necessary because when the ground forces go in, it's necessary the enemy's been softened up as much as possible to reduce the risk to the ground forces. Because of course, you know, people often forget this. They talk about civilian casualties, they talk about Hamas casualties, people very often don't think about Israeli military casualties, which is extremely important. An Israeli soldier's life is no less valuable than anyone else's life. And a commander who's devising the strategy has a duty to prosecute an operation or a war in a way that minimizes his own casualties, his own military casualties, for two reasons. One, a moral reason, obviously the value of life, and secondly, because you need as many soldiers alive as possible to complete the operation.
So, Colonel, one of the things that I was watching was an analysis that said all these tunnels under Gaza, what is often referred to as the Gaza Metro, work very effectively during times of peace. You can move people around, you can move weapons around, but at times of war, they're a disaster because you're trapped and you can't get out. What's your perspective on the Gaza Metro?
Well, I've been into these tunnels underneath Gaza, and one thing that people ought to be aware of, they're not, is they're extremely well constructed. They're heavily protected. They have concrete walls, floors, ceilings, air conditioning, lighting, and they have the capability to store a lot of combat supplies. So they're very, very valuable. They're valuable in peacetime for initiating operations, but they're also very valuable in war, of course, because it enables terrorist commanders to shelter in safety. It enables terrorists to be moved around the Gaza Strip, let's say, to come up behind advancing IDF forces and attack them from the rear, that sort of movement. But yes, of course, there is a danger in doing that, because it does, if your enemy knows what they're doing, then they can blow up the tunnel or destroy the entrances of the tunnel and trap you inside. And that's what the IDF has been doing in a lot of cases here. But it's and in fact, in the last, not the last, but a couple of rounds of fighting in Gaza ago, the IDF very successfully launched air attacks against one particular tunnel system and killed a very large number of terrorists inside that tunnel. So in some ways, it's a double-edged weapon, but it's their primary purpose is to be able to operate with relative safety when there's a conflict going on.
Dave, if we can turn to you, because what is a legitimate target and what is a non-legitimate target becomes a very complex issue in an environment where these tunnels run through and under hospitals, through mosques, through schools, where rocket launchers are in the playgrounds of schools or in cub centers attached to schools. What becomes a legitimate target? Or if a hospital has a tunnel and a command and control center underneath it, is the hospital now a legitimate military target?
So the short answer is anything, any building or installation which serves a military purpose is a legitimate target, and whose destruction or partial destruction gives you a military benefit is a legitimate target. As you rightly say, the tactic of Hamas, there are very few targets which are, let's say, on the face of them look like military targets. Gaza, for the most part, if you look at Gaza from the outside, it's all civilian, right? All of Hamas's military hardware, its assets, its control centers, its weapons, it's all embedded in civilian areas. Not just buildings that look civilian, but buildings that actually function as civilian buildings, right? So they are in schools where kids actually study, or in hospitals where people actually get treated, or in mosques where people go to pray. Okay, or in residential buildings where people actually live. That's a typical modus operandi of Hamas. Of course, the challenge is, if you're the adversary of Hamas, right, how do you know where the targets are? Okay, and of course, the answer to that is that your intelligence gives you the answer to that, because there's nothing on the face of it, or very little on the face of it, looks like a military target. So it's a major intelligence challenge to even know where the targets are. There's an additional intelligence challenge to be able to make that call about whether an attack is proportionate or not. You have to also have an idea of how much collateral damage, how much damage to civilians is possible. So you really have two problems here. One is to know where the targets are, and also to know where the civilians are. Now, obviously, this is not a court of law, right? You've got a limited amount of time as to how much you can spend on studying this and how much information you can gather. All right. So there are limitations to what you can get. I can tell you the IDF has pretty high threshold of certainty that it demands before a target is attacked. But that's the reality we're in. So the answer is anything that serves a military purpose for Hamas But again, and it doesn't actually matter if it's ostensibly a civilian building. That doesn't immunize it. Obviously, you have to have enough information, enough evidence that it is actually a legitimate military target. And that makes it harder. Maybe I just need to point something out, Howard, I should have mentioned before. I'm not sure if it goes without saying, but this is the challenge. The laws of war, okay, don't demand reciprocity. That is to say, if you're up against an adversary that does not respect the laws of war, it doesn't absolve you from obeying the laws of war. Okay, that's maybe unfair. Okay, but when I gave the example of Australia, Canada, right, both countries obeying the laws of war, you would actually find probably very limited damage to civilians, among other things, which would make it different. But when you have one law-abiding party, the state of Israel, coming up against a party, it breaks just about every possible law. If you go through a list of the laws of war, you'll find that Hamas breaks just about every single one of them. The reality is, okay, and that's accepted, and Israel has taken this upon itself willingly, okay, that Israel conducts itself in accordance with international humanitarian law, even though Hamas does not do so.
So, Colonel, how's Israel done from a military perspective? Have they done better, worse? How has the campaign actually gone, and how has Hamas's campaign within Gaza gone?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is from my discussions with IDF commanders and also by my observation of what's going on the ground and from the media, the IDF have been extremely successful on the ground. And from the air, yes, very successful. On the ground, also extremely successful. And I think they achieved their objectives inside Gaza before the ceasefire occurred far faster than was anticipated, and also with greater success against Hamas terrorists and fewer IDF casualties. There have been quite a few IDF casualties, but not as many as I think were expected. So from all of those three angles, I think the IDF operations so far have been extremely successful. Another indicator of how successful they've been is that Hamas pressed for this ceasefire. Hamas was desperate to have this ceasefire, which has resulted happily in the release of, I think, something in the area of 80 hostages, maybe more by now. But for Hamas, it wasn't about releasing hostages, it was about getting themselves breathing space and buying time, because they needed time. They knew they were on the road to disaster. They knew that ultimately they would be annihilated. Not necessarily every single person killed, but they would be largely destroyed by the IDF if the IDF continued. And so they pushed for the ceasefire. And in pushing for the ceasefire and in subsequently drip feeding more hostages out, their hope and expectation, certainly hope, is that the ceasefire will go on and on and on. And I think that is the danger. Of course, it's incredibly good that so many hostages have been released. But the deal that Hamas struck was exceptional, I think, for Hamas, agreeing to the release of 3 convicted terrorists for every hostage released. It sounds like a very bad deal, and it is, but it was nothing like the kind of deal Hamas normally drives for. For example, when Gilad Shalit was released a few years back, 1,027 Hamas terrorists were released in exchange for 1 IDF soldier. That's what the kind of level they're normally looking for. The fact they were prepared to accept this ceasefire terms shows their desperation, shows how problematic this situation is for them. My fear now is, and it's a horrible thing to say in a way for any decent person, but my fear now is that the ceasefire will go on indefinitely, and that the United States will pressure Israel to not resume fighting. Now, I hope that doesn't happen, and the reason I hope it doesn't happen is not because I want to see more civilians killed, but I don't want to see Hamas survive, because then if the IDF does not resume its fighting, Hamas remains as the threat. Hamas has won effectively. They've been badly damaged, but they're still a threat. And that's not just a threat to Israel, but it's a threat to the world, because a victory for Hamas, which it would be portrayed as, is an inspiration and an encouragement to jihadists everywhere, just as the Islamic State, when it was in its heyday and gaining territory and gaining successes, inspired jihadists to attack in the UK, in the US, in other countries around the world, and that's the effect that would have. That would be that would be the effect of Israel not resuming hostilities. I've no doubt that the Prime Minister, the government, want to resume hostilities. The Prime Minister said so today, but he's under great pressure from the President of the United States, who wants this war ended, and I hope he can withstand that pressure.
Were you surprised that, in fact, the Israeli army were only able to rescue one hostage? They got one hostage and ultimately two bodies that they managed to retrieve. In my mind, they would have had sufficient intelligence to be able to locate hostages, get more out without a ceasefire having taken place. Has it surprised you that, in fact, they didn't know where the hostages were?
Well, let's say that the only reason that 80 or whatever number it is hostages have been released now is because of the IDF military action that forced Hamas to release these hostages. So they have in effect achieved that. But you're right to say that it's been achieved only by a ceasefire. And no, it didn't surprise me that the IDF got only one hostage out so far through their own military action. I've been involved in hostage rescue situations on several occasions of British citizens captured and kidnapped and held hostage in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And I think, I forget the exact number, but something like 6 or 7 of those situations I was involved in. Each of them a great deal easier than this situation because they involved in each case only 1 or 2 hostages. So much, much more straightforward in a way. But of those 6 or 7, whatever it was, I think only 1 was successful. These are terribly difficult operations to carry out because you have to remember that the enemy, Hamas in this case, knows that the IDF will try and rescue the hostage. Therefore, they will make sure they're in a place that it's very hard to find them. They keep it very secure in information terms. They make it very secure in defensive terms. They will rig the place with explosives. They will have booby traps ready. They will have armed terrorists ready. They will have a gun to the head of the hostages so that if a rescue operation begins, the hostage is the first person to die. And it's incredibly difficult to achieve success in that situation, particularly with this very large number of hostages. And I think I would just point to 2 things that you must have to carry out a successful rescue operation. And even with them, it doesn't mean it's going to succeed. And the first thing is pinpoint intelligence, exact location where the individual is. And you have to also assume that the terrorists are going to move them from time to time. So you may be back to square one once you've got that intelligence. And secondly, you've got to have surprise. If you aren't able to achieve surprise, as I've just described, the terrorists will kill the hostage straight out and probably try and kill the rescuers as well. So you've got to get surprised somehow. If you don't have those 2 things, you've got no hope, and they're very difficult to achieve.
David, one of the things that came out of the hostages that were released yesterday is one of the hostages told reporters that they were held captive in the attic of a school principal or a school teacher, an UNRWA school teacher's attic. So hostages are being placed in the middle of civilian infrastructure once again. Now, one of the other hostages said they were held captive in a doctor pediatrician's home, and they could hear the doctor treating the patients in the house. How clearly, once again, turning all of that civilian infrastructure into legitimate military targets.
Yeah, those individuals would, because they would be taking a direct and active part in hostilities, the doctor, the UNRWA worker, yes, they would become themselves legitimate targets. Okay, they're helping Hamas in advancing its hostilities. It's a terribly unfortunate reality, as Colonel Kemp said. When Hamas, they certainly wear their uniforms on parade, but often when it comes to actually engaging the IDF, they show up in civilian clothes, or if they can, they get hold of IDF uniforms. Both, by the way, are war crimes, both of those. But yeah, as I said, they break just about every rule in the rule book. They seem to think it's their right, being the underdog somehow allows them to do what they like. And a lot of the world seems to accept that approach.
Colonel Kemp, let us presume that you were advising the IDF. I don't know if you do or you don't. What do you advise them relating to hostages? Do you say, give the ceasefire, allow Hamas to reorganize, rearm, and have difficulties starting the conflict again in order to destroy Hamas, but at least get as many hostages out as possible? Or do you say the military objectives are more important? If you were in that difficult position to have to give that advice, what call would you make? What advice would you give?
Well, the first thing I'd say is the IDF don't need my advice. They know their job and they're doing it very well. But if I was in that position, then I would, there are two aspects really. And the first one is purely military. And of course, it's a disadvantage to any military force to cease fighting when you've got a roll on, when you've gained momentum. It's going to be a disadvantage. It's going to give the enemy advantages that you don't want to give them. But there's then the respect and the absolute determination to rescue those hostages. That has to be taken into account. It's much more of a political decision than a military decision, I think, that particular one. From a purely military perspective, I would say push forward, carry on attacking, and do everything to get the hostages out. But with a political headline, I would say that I would agree with the decision taken to go for this deal. I think the real risk in this is that is not that Hamas gets advantage. Hamas will get tactical advantage in this. There's no doubt. On the ground, they will get some, but I think that tactical advantage is going to be relatively marginal. It's going to be relevant. IDF soldiers might die as a result of it, but it's going to be relatively marginal in the overall picture. Also, Israel will have time. They will have spent time. I'm absolutely certain the IDF will have spent time studying the lessons learned already from this war, seeing how Hamas fights, seeing how they operate, communicating that, retraining their soldiers, preparing for the next stage, and making themselves more combat effective as a result. So there might be a bit of a balance there. But I think that overall, in overall political and military terms, I would do what Israel has done. But I mentioned before, it is extremely important that the Israeli government does not allow itself now to be pressured by the United States into not continuing to prosecute the war.
So is Hamas capable of being defeated? Realistically, I mean, one can go in, one can destroy much of the military, one can break their tunnel infrastructure substantially. Is Hamas as an enemy capable of physically being defeated?
Yeah, any enemy is, as long as you've got the military power and the political will to go to the end. And there are three real ways, I think, in which Hamas can be defeated. One is by killing as many of them as possible and destroying their combat capabilities, their equipment. Secondly, by terrifying them, shall we say, into leaving. And I'm sure some of the leaders of Hamas have already left the Gaza Strip. Others will do so. Get them out, get them away. They want to live to fight another day. Let them go somewhere else. Okay, that doesn't remove them as a problem, but it's not the immediate problem. And thirdly, to convince them through absolute military violence that their cause is lost, that they can no longer operate, that they lay down their weapons, they melt back into the civilian population. Again, that's not the problem solved, but you're not going to kill every one of them. And so you have to accept that some are going to get away, some are going to kind of just disappear, give up fighting, and you've achieved your immediate objective. Of course, they will re-emerge either as Hamas or as something else. They will re-emerge. The population in Gaza that Hamas come from, in the overwhelming majority of cases, absolutely opposed to Israel, and coming up from that population will be more Hamas equivalents. The other dimension to consider is the leadership of Hamas. Hamas have leaders in Qatar, they have leaders in Turkey and in Lebanon, and they have a lot of fighters in Lebanon. They have quite a lot of fighters in Judea and Samaria as well. So those people have to be dealt with. Now, I think, I wouldn't want to suggest or advise to the Israeli government how it goes about that, particularly the leadership in Qatar. But I think there is maybe an indication from the reaction of Israel after the Munich Olympic massacre in '72, when Mossad hunted down and killed the vast majority of those terrorists that were responsible for that massacre. And I would expect something similar to proceed over, perhaps over a number of years after this conflict is finished.
One of the things that we did see was the Americans moved aircraft carriers, entire massive amounts of military equipment into the Mediterranean and also into the Red Sea. What was that about? Why is there such a presence of American armed forces off the coast of Israel, off the coast of Lebanon, and in the Red Sea at the moment?
Well, I think those two American carrier strike groups, one in the Eastern Mediterranean, one in the Red Sea, were deployed there for two reasons. One, to deter Iran. Of course, Iran is behind this whole thing, as I intimated before. The IRGC and other elements of the Iranian government using their proxies in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, and elsewhere, in Iraq and elsewhere. And it was these carrier strike groups were there to just deter Iran. And of course, the one in the Eastern Mediterranean was there to deter Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy that has 15,000 missiles and a very large number of ground forces as well. But secondly, they were there, I think, to deter Israel. And I don't mean deter in the same way by threatening Israel with military force, but I think to give Israel the impression, the understanding that America would do the dirty work if that was necessary, or would at least help do the dirty work. I don't believe they will, but I think that was part of it to shall we say, rather than deter, let's say discourage Israel from carrying out an attack in the north on Hezbollah, or indeed directly on Iran, which Iran deserves to be attacked, frankly. I'm not necessarily advocating it, but Iran is the real enemy here and will remain the real enemy, whether Hamas is destroyed or not.
So Johnny, in fact, asked us about some of these other fringe groups, things like Islamic Jihad. Are they relevant in the battle, in the conflict at the moment in Gaza?
Yeah, Islamic Jihad is the second biggest terrorist group in Gaza, and they were involved in the 7th of October massacre, as indeed was a Fatah element from Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah organization, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. They had terrorists that took part in the 7th of October operation. So Mahmoud Abbas did not have clean hands either in this war. But they're a significant element. They've been involved in fighting. They've been involved in firing rockets at Israel. And of course, let's not forget, it was an Islamic Jihad rocket that dropped short and landed in the parking lot of the Al-Ali hospital, killing a number of people, for which Israel was blamed by people like CNN and the BBC immediately without any evidence or thought. So yeah, Islamic Jihad and other groups like the PFLP in Gaza as well. All of these groups will be taking part in the fighting.
I feel compelled, seeing you mentioned the BBC. There have been a number of people who've posed questions about the BBC coverage of the entire war, the failure to call Hamas a terrorist organization, and a lot of very biased, personalized reporting that's taken place. What's your perspective of the BBC?
Well, if I say the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which is a well-known Jewish organization based in the United States, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, named the BBC as I think it was the number 2 or number 3 anti-Semitic organization in the world, just behind Iran. So that tells you what you need to know about the BBC. They're absolutely fundamentally opposed to Israel. That's not a formal statement, because of course the BBC is effectively the state broadcaster of the UK. All of us British people pay our license fee for the BBC, and they should be independent, but they're far from independent. They're not the only offender. They're not the only one that slants every single report they do against Israel. Sky News is another very virulent example. But I should make one point. I myself am a human shield for the BBC. For the last 10 or so years, the BBC have not allowed me to speak about Israel. I speak on the BBC frequently on Afghanistan, Iraq, the Ukraine war, various other conflicts, any other conflict, but never allowed to talk about Israel because they know that my my opinions will go against their anti-Israel agenda. But that's for 10 years. I've not been allowed to do it. A couple of weeks into this campaign, about 3 weeks into the campaign, I received a phone call from the BBC. Will you come and do an interview on the news channel on Israel? I thought, what the hell is this about? And then I realized it was after the Al-Ali hospital debacle, in which the BBC accused Israel and was proved to be lying about it effectively. And they wanted to show how broad they were, how they took into account all views. And so they even had this extremist here talking on the BBC. And since then, I've done about 3 or 4 other interviews on the BBC.
You're a good human shield. Colonel, we've got a lot of questions for David Benjamin about South Africa and South Africa's approach, and we are going to get to that because South Africa has laid charges against Prime Minister Netanyahu at the International Criminal Court. Our president, in all his great wisdom, called what was happening in Gaza genocide, a Holocaust of Palestinians, and described Gaza as a concentration camp. So we're going to discuss all of that with David Benjamin in a second. But there are some more military questions that I'd love to ask you, if I may. The first is about Iran, and Michael on YouTube has specifically wanted to know the role of Iran in all of this, and how does the world react? How should the world react?
Well, Iran is the Ayatollahs. I like. Can you pass that wine over here, Howard? I wouldn't mind
Coke Zero, I'm afraid, but
okay.
But I'm happy to have a tequila with you afterwards.
You can keep the Coke Zero. I was hoping for a drop of South African wine.
Come visit. Yeah. I'll promise you a case on a wine farm.
Thank you very much. I mean, Iran. The supreme leader of Iran many times, and other senior people in the Iranian government, have made it clear they intend to destroy Israel. That's one of their primary objectives. America, death to Israel, death to the UK as well, by the way. And I think anyone who, particularly after the 7th of October, but actually before that as well, anybody who doubts their seriousness needs to examine their own head, because you have to assume, if they're saying that, that's what they mean to do. And of course, one of the greatest fears is that they will acquire, as they're well on the way to, will acquire nuclear weapons to use against Israel, as well as maybe their other enemies in the region, like Saudi Arabia. But meanwhile, they have a very, very effective proxy network all around the Middle East, in Lebanon, in Syria, inside Judea and Samaria, in Gaza, in Iraq, and numerous other countries, many of which are dedicated against Israel. And for example, Hezbollah was created by Iran in the early 1980s, and have fought and carried out many attacks against Israel, including intensive attacks over the period of this particular conflict. And that's how they generally operate. They'll use proxies. The real problem, I think, and the question about how the West reacts. Well, I believe that the appeasement of Iran, which we've seen from the Biden administration since it took office, including, for example, categorizing the Houthis, an Iranian proxy, decategorizing them as a terrorist organization. They've carried out several attempted attacks against Israel since the war began. But the US government, with its helpful allies in Europe, including the UK, have just appeased Iran. They've allowed Iran to get away with numerous attacks against US forces in Iraq and in Syria without any serious response. They've allowed Iran proxies to get away with attacks against Saudi Arabia and the UAE without any serious response, all of which is intended to follow Barack Obama's policy of coming to a nuclear deal with Iran, which of course would not be worth the paper it's written on, and is in fact a nuclear pathway for Iran, but is portrayed as a nuclear deal. And that appeasement has included unfreezing of vast sums of frozen assets made available to Iran, giving Iran vast amounts of money separate to that, and generally encouraging Iran. And all of that money, of course, although those people who facilitated in the US deny that it's used for that, but all that money is available and used to fund some of these Iranian proxies that attack Israel and attack the US itself. So it's a very messy and difficult situation. But until the US and the West get to grips with the fact that Iran is the real enemy here, I think we're going to see continued aggression against Iran. It needs to be stopped. And let's not forget, it's not just against the Middle East. Iran has proxies in Europe. It undoubtedly will have proxies in South Africa. It has proxies in America. It has people who are ready to carry out terrorist attacks when required against countries around the world. And of course, it has supplied the Russian army with a large number of attack drones to attack Ukrainian civilians. And I've been in Kiev, for example, when drones have been fired, attack drones have been fired at Kiev with the deliberate intention of attacking innocent civilians. It's probably, not necessarily the most powerful country in the world, but one of the greatest supporters and sponsors of terrorism.
So, Colonel, we can't predict the future, but that doesn't mean to say that it's going to stop us. When the ceasefire or this pause, as people refer to it, ends, what happens then, and what is the end game? How does this entire conflict play out over the next few months? What happens in 2 months' time?
Well, I hope the ceasefire will end at some point. I hope after all the hostages have been released, or if there's no prospect of any further release, and as soon as possible. And then the IDF has still got some operations to conduct in the northern part of Gaza, and undoubtedly very quickly afterwards or concurrently will move south as well into Khan Yunis and Rafah. So they will have to attack Hamas in the southern part of Gaza. That's going to be a hugely challenging operation because the vast majority of the Gazan population is now down in the south. Israel has identified a safe area in the southwest of Gaza, small area by the sea, in which civilians have been encouraged already by the IDF to leave places like Khan Yunis and head for this area in the southwest. And disgracefully, the UN was asked by Israel to set up a refugee center there to look after these refugees, and declined to do so on the pretext that this was going to in some way be collaborating with Israel's war, which of course is not true. It was simply to try and take care of those civilians that were forced to take refuge in the southwest. And that's I think a disgraceful a policy of the UN, which does need to be examined further. So that's the future, I think, is intensive operations in the south, probably quite protracted because of the large number of civilians. And after that, once the IDF have decided they have completed the destruction of Hamas, or at least the removal of the ability of Hamas to threaten Israel, then, in my opinion, the IDF have to remain in Gaza. They have to remain in Gaza permanently. And that could be, obviously, the decisions are taken by the IDF. They will have to figure out what they want to do, but that could be a permanent presence of the IDF throughout Gaza. It could be maybe the construction of buffer zones inside the Gaza border, which no one's allowed to live or move, and is monitored by the IDF. It could include IDF forces on the border or in the buffer zone, ready to move in and out however they wish. Because as I mentioned before, even once Hamas has been removed, there is there's every likelihood, in fact, there's certainty that a successor to Hamas will arrive inside Gaza or attempt to, and the IDF will have to police that in the same way as they've been policing, let's say, Judea and Samaria.
Is it too optimistic to believe that this may usher in a new era after the war, in the same way that after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, it opened the way for Egypt and Israel to make peace together? Is it too much optimism to believe that maybe the vast amount of destruction and the price paid in this war may move people towards peace?
I think the one optimistic note that I would sound is one of the reasons I believe that Iran launched this operation using its proxy Hamas was because of its concern about the approaching normalization of relationships between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And I think it wanted to disrupt that. That's something it will not will do its best not to tolerate. I do think, contrary to what many people's opinion is, I do think that it is quite probable that normalization will go ahead after this war is over. And I think to get Saudi Arabia to normalize with Israel, we'll get numerous other Arab countries to join as well, following on the footsteps of the Abraham Accords. And I think that could, the reason I say this is because Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, UAE, pretty much every other Arab country wants Israel to defeat Hamas. They want Israel to destroy Hamas. They know that the Hamas ideology, part of the Muslim Brotherhood, threatens their own countries, and they want to see Israel eliminated. Despite what they might say publicly, they'll give different messages publicly, as always. But that's what they really want. And they want a strong Israel. They want a strong Israel as a bulwark against Iran, which is opposed to most of them as well. So I think that's the kind of glimmer of hope, which might, in time, and it's not going to be a short time, but the normalization between Israel and more Arab countries, I think, will help towards isolating the Palestinian people, the Palestinian agenda. And don't forget that the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, have the same agenda as Hamas, the elimination of Israel. They're not interested in a two-state solution. They're interested only in getting rid of Israel. They have different means. They don't necessarily say it in English anyway, publicly, but that's their intention. And I think it's really important that that whole movement is isolated from the rest of the Arab world, which may possibly encourage them to look for a different path.
Colonel, I don't know what your time is like this evening. We have a few more questions for David. I don't know if you have time to stay with us, but if you want to hop off and go get some rest before tomorrow, you're more than welcome to do that as well. But it has been such an honor and privilege to have you on this broadcast this evening, and you've answered so many of the questions that members of the audience have posed. So if you're willing to and able to stay with us, please feel free to do that. If you do need to hop off, we absolutely understand that as well.
Thank you. It's been a tremendous pleasure, Howard, to speak to you, even though I can't see your other viewers, but it's been really good, and thank you for inviting me on. And I will stay listening to David for as long as I possibly can, because whenever I hear him speak, I always learn a great deal from him.
So Dave, just before we do, but I'm going to show a 5-minute video, because I think it's one of the best videos I've ever seen on the concept of asymmetric warfare. And as we show it, I'm just going to ask the people who are watching us, and we literally have thousands and thousands of people across all the channels. We have over 6,000 people who are busy watching us live at the moment. I'm just going to ask people to leave a message for Colonel Kemp as well, and just show some of their appreciation for both him and for you for joining us this evening. As we show this very short 5-minute video, it's by a man called Nick Freitas. I don't know if either of you have come across him. Former American military individual, and now a senator in the Virginia Senate. But I think he encapsulates in 5 minutes a remarkable understanding of Hamas's strategy and how they use people in the West to, in fact, fight their battle for them. And when we've watched these 5 minutes, Dave, we're going to come back and we're going to talk to you about some of these bizarre statements that have come out of the South African government. And we're going to talk about what is genocide and what is apartheid and what is a Holocaust and these charges laid at the International Criminal Court. We'll do that in about 5 minutes' time.
Why would a battle fought 54 years ago provide key insight on what Hamas's strategy is today? Asymmetric warfare. It's a term that most people don't really understand. Before I did this, I was a United States Army Green Beret, and I did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. And needless to say, asymmetric warfare was kind of our thing. So in practical terms, it is a type of war between belligerents whose relative military power, strategy, or tactics differ significantly. And as a result of this, the weaker opponent will use unconventional tactics in order to maximize one's strengths against a stronger opponent's weaknesses or vulnerabilities. For instance, an insurgent force does not have the freedom of movement or firepower necessary to attack a forward operating base or a heavily armed column. So instead, they focus on softer logistical targets. They may choose to use a remotely activated roadside bomb instead of engaging in direct fire. In many situations, the weaker adversary has fewer personnel and resources, and so a significant part of their strategy is to preserve those limited resources and use the munitions that they have to the greatest possible advantage. But here's the thing. To pull this off long term, you generally need a consistent means of supply combined with enough territory to hit, run, and then hide. And Hamas doesn't have these things, at least not in sufficient supply to win against the IDF. So what's their strategy? What can Hamas leverage that will allow them to conduct offensive operations against a much stronger opponent and then avoid getting destroyed by the IDF's vastly superior military capability? And the answer to that question, as horrific as it is civilian casualties, but probably not the ones you're thinking. To understand this, let's discuss that example 54 years ago. The Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War virtually wiped out the Viet Cong. It was by every objective measure a complete tactical failure, but strategically, it was invaluable. Because while achieving none of its military objectives, the Tet Offensive shattered Americans' perspective on the situation on the ground. Opponents of the war were able to effectively use the offensive as a demonstration of the futility of American involvement. Hollywood, academia, and many in the mainstream media went to work convincing the American people that the war couldn't be won, or perhaps just shouldn't even be fought. And in a representative government, when the electorate decides that a war is lost, it is, regardless of the situation on the ground. Now, understand something. I'm not making an argument for the pros or cons of fighting the Vietnam War. I'm merely illustrating a point about modern asymmetric warfare. The lesson of the Tet Offensive is when fighting the West, you don't defeat their military. You win their electorate. And the way to do that is through the institutions which shape culture in the West, namely Hollywood, the media, and academia. If Hamas had decided to engage in a conventional military attack directed at only legitimate military targets, the IDF would have effectively destroyed their warfighting capability within days, and Hamas knows it. So they engaged an asymmetric strategy. Once we understand this, their actions on October 7th, as horrific as they are, begin to make more sense. Hamas didn't just target civilians because they were easy targets or because they despised Jews, although both of those things are true. The attack and the subsequent taking of hostages was actually designed to elicit a major response from the IDF. But why? Well, maybe it's because to achieve their strategic objectives, Hamas needs civilian casualties. And more specifically, they need Palestinian civilian casualties. And this is why. The two entities in this conflict that lose the most from a greater peace agreement in the Middle East are Iran and the terrorist organizations they support. Upsetting this process requires much more than the random launching of rockets into Israel or strikes against legitimate military targets. The IDF is more than capable of handling such incursions, and the Israeli people have become all too accustomed to weathering such attacks without demanding an overwhelming military response. Something more significant was required, and October 7th created the kind of conditions that demanded a significant and sustained response. They needed something so obscene that Israel would have no choice but to hit back hard. And this is where the second component of Hamas's strategy plays out: how to get Palestinian casualties. Any government actually worried about civilian casualties dedicates resources to evacuating their own civilians from hostile areas and attempts to separate the civilian population from legitimate military targets. So what conclusion should we come to when a governing body decides to do the exact opposite? In this asymmetric environment, Hamas is not only incentivized to kill Israeli civilians, they're incentivized to maximize their own civilian casualties in the short run in order to elicit Western intervention on their behalf. As easy as it might be to explain Hamas's strategy away as nothing but mindless bloodlust, it is actually more sinister than that. Hamas is responding to the incentive structures certain elements within the West have created. Hamas understands that the real battlefield is not in Gaza, but in the streets, university halls, and newsrooms of the West. And so that is their target. And while a ceasefire seems like a humanitarian response to the tragic death of civilians, leaving Hamas intact as an operational and governing body will ultimately just reinforce that the perverse incentive structure remains the same. And that while the West may claim to not negotiate with terrorists, they always seem to force Israel to as soon as it becomes politically inconvenient for them. So here's the hard reality. If you actually want to achieve anything resembling a lasting peace in this part of the world, you're never going to achieve it by creating conditions where terrorists are incentivized to hurt both the civilians of their enemies and their own in order to achieve their political objectives.
That is Nick Freitas. You can follow him on Instagram or on YouTube. A very interesting perspective of the world. Dave Benjamin, there's been a lot of comments about the role of the Red Cross and UNRWA. Are people taking out their frustrations on them, or are they legitimate targets for criticism?
I think you need to separate the two, first of all. UNRWA is a very strange creature. Okay. In the entire world, there are two organizations who are designated by the UN to deal with the problem of refugees the world over. Okay. One is UNRWA, which deals with the Palestinian refugees. I say refugees in the widest sense, because you can argue about to what extent Palestinians are actually refugees, but let's say they are. The other organization, the High Commissioner for Refugees, is there to deal with all the other refugees in the world, right? So there's one for all the refugees in the world and one only for the Palestinian refugees, two organizations. And UNRWA, I can't remember the exact size of it, but it's a very, very large organization. By the way, it needs explaining. You know, you often hear in the news the IDF attacked or struck near an UNRWA facility where people were taking shelter, an UNRWA school, etc. You need to know that the UNRWA is all over Gaza. It's not just there's one UN headquarters here or there. It really is everywhere. By the vast majority of schools in Gaza are run by UNRWA. Many of the medical facilities are run by UNRWA. They are really ubiquitous. They're everywhere. It's a very large organization, well-funded organization. And the fact is, most of the population of Gaza are a basket case tended to by UNRWA, because the actual rulers of Gaza, namely Hamas, as they themselves declared quite proudly, they don't see themselves as being responsible for their population. They see themselves as being responsible for the struggle against Israel, as they put it, and let the international community take care. That was a recent interview given by one of the Hamas leaders, actually made that 100% clear. One of the advantages we have of Hamas is that they say what they mean. They say what they intend much of the time, not all the time, but much of the time. So we need to take them at their word. So UNRWA is a very problematic organization. It also employs many, many people on the ground. It has international employees. It also has local employees. And many of those local employees are Hamas operatives, people who cooperate with Hamas. I mean, that's all the time. So it's difficult. It's a problematic organization. The Red Cross, yes, there is criticism, but I wouldn't put them in the same category as UNRWA. Okay. Certainly the Red Cross, they serve a very specific role, which is actually set out in the Genevan Conventions. It's the only international organization that has a defined role in international law. It's supposed to be entirely neutral, not take sides in any conflict in any way, okay, and merely to advance humanitarian interests of the civilian population in war. That's the role of the Red Cross. So you can see that they would be involved in, for example, trading prisoners, etc. Yes, I think the Red Cross has shown itself to be biased to some extent. But again, let's not put them in the same category as UNRWA, which I don't think UNRWA really has a legitimate reason to exist today. You know, when we talk about refugee camps in Gaza, I think many in the world get the wrong idea, right? Perhaps in South Africa, you have places you imagine look like refugee camps, right? Crossroads in Cape Town, places like that. That's what you might imagine when you think of a refugee camp. Refugee camp is actually a town like any other town with apartment blocks and shops and malls, etc. That's a refugee camp. Just the people there define themselves or are defined by the Palestinian polity as refugees for political convenience. And of course, Palestinians who live in other countries outside in the Arab world are considered refugees. They're kept in limbo. They're not given full rights as civilians. It's a festering sore which has been going on since 1948. And for some reason, no one in the world wants to take care of it. You know, the contrast is with the Jewish refugees, right? There were more Jewish refugees from Arab countries than there were Arab refugees from Israel. No one talks about them because they've been rehabilitated. Only the Palestinian refugees who are still around after 48, nobody wants to rehabilitate them.
In fact, in the years post the Second World War, there were more than 80 million refugees around the world.
Correct.
One doesn't speak about the Polish refugees today, the German refugees today. Those problems have all been solved.
And the world regards as the descendants of the original Palestinian refugees as refugees too. So it's a growing population of refugees. Instead of not just being rehabilitated and reducing that population, the population is actually growing steadily. And UNRWA is getting progressively larger as it's funded by the UN, by the countries who make up the UN, just to deal with this Palestinian issue. It's kind of crazy, right? It somehow there's a feeling that just because it had to do with Israel, then it gets a completely different set of standards than any other conflict in the world.
But I think people also mistakenly believe that the United Nations is somehow a court of justice. It's not. It's a political parliament. You know, you don't expect justice from the South African parliament or most parliaments around the world. And the United Nations is a politically driven, politically motivated organization with no moral authority. It just allows groups of countries to get together, many of whom are human rights abusers and dictators, to have a place where they can share ideas and often spew their hate. They have no moral authority over Israel or anyone else for that matter.
Well, a classic example is the United Nations Human Rights Council, right? Which you know, tiny Israel gets about 2/3 of the attention of the Human Rights Council, and the other third is devoted to issues in the rest of the world.
And currently chaired by Iran, probably the worst human rights abuser in the world.
Correct. Really, unfortunately, the UN is not, it's far from fulfilling the role it was set up to fill.
So, David, let's talk about South Africa and the approach to South Africa. I would describe as our ruling party and much of our media as nothing short of toxic. And we throw away these terms continuously, genocide. Let's start with the term genocide. What is genocide? And have we seen genocide being committed by either the Palestinians or by the Israelis in this process?
Okay, so what I did in anticipation of a question like this, I'm going to read out the definition of genocide as it appears in the statute of the International Criminal Court. Okay, so that's not the only definition, but it's a generally accepted definition of genocide. For the purpose of the statute, genocide means any of the following acts committed, this is important, with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial or religious group as such, and by killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Okay, so that's the definition of genocide, internationally accepted definition as in the statute of the International Criminal Court. Okay, well, let's talk about the accusation of genocide against Israel. Okay, now sometimes there are some accusations which the very readiness to even discuss it or engage with it, okay, somehow gives it a credence it doesn't deserve. I'll give you an example, right? If I was told, David, prove that you're not a zebra, okay? So I could say, well, you know, is that a conversation I really need to have? You know, when it's so obvious from the facts on the ground that isn't the case, right? I have less hair than a zebra, I wear glasses, I'm wearing clothes. I mean, there are all kinds of other things, but it feels a bit ridiculous to even have to take that on. And I would say that's the category which the accusation of genocide against Israel in Gaza falls into. You know, it's really the most unsuccessful genocide in history. The Palestinian population in Gaza and generally has only grown over the last several years, right? It really has no basis in fact whatsoever. As I say, and it feels a bit strange to even have to address that accusation. There's a much more important question is whether the acts of Hamas in Israel constitute genocide. So this depends on how willing you are to take Hamas as they really are and not as the way they brand themselves, okay? Because Hamas has an original charter from 1988, and there it's pretty clear that one of the aims of Hamas is to kill Jews wherever they find them, okay? It says that pretty much clearly in that charter. What they've done, obviously with some PR advice, is to rebrand themselves in a 2017 charter. But let me stress, this is just rebranding, okay? It's still the same product, it's the same service, so to speak. It's the same Hamas, okay? In the new one, they say they're not interested, they don't have a problem with Jews as a religion, they have a problem just with Zionism, right? That's a well-known well-known tactic of the greatest anti-Semites. Okay, so of course you do have to show that Hamas has not changed its spots or its stripes, so to speak. It's the same Hamas, just with a different branding. It's pretty clear, we know from the interrogation of the people who took part in the massacre on October 7th, that they were given orders to just kill Jews, right? And there are plenty of statements out there of Hamas leaders over the years which talk about killing Jews, or at a minimum, just kill the Jews in Israel for a start. So does that qualify as genocide? Well, you don't necessarily have to succeed in the mission. Even Hitler didn't succeed in wiping out the Jewish people, okay? But with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, it is ethnical, I don't know if there's such a word, racial or religious group. So I'll leave that to the jury, but I think there's a strong case to be made that Hamas has committed genocide in its actions of October 7th.
The firing of, we've had more than 10,000 rockets fired by Hamas at Israeli civilian centers. Is that a crime against humanity? Is that a war crime?
That's definitely a war crime. Indiscriminate attacks against civilians, absolutely, it's a war crime. I actually made a list here of all of the crimes that Hamas can be accused of. It's quite an extensive list, just about every crime, but they're very, very clear examples. Do you want to read out the list if you think?
Why don't you select 2 or 3 just to give us kind of almost a sense and a flavor?
Okay, there's murder, there's torture, there's rape, there's taking hostages, persecution, utilizing the presence of a civilian or other protected person to render certain points, areas, or military forces immune from military operations. That's what we call human shielding. Conscripting or enlisting children under the age of 15 years into the national armed forces, using them to participate actively in hostilities, intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population, against civilian objects, making improper use of status, civilian status, or the uniform of the enemy, pillaging. I mean, that's what anymore. Okay, I think that we can suffice with those. I think it's a fairly impressive list. By the way, which are all open and shut cases. These are all open and shut. They've all been committed in full view, and as you pointed out, proudly filmed by the perpetrators.
So I'm not going to discuss this nonsense of Holocaust and concentration camp, but I do want to talk about the fact that South Africa, together with another 3 bizarrely human rights abusing countries, went and laid charges at the International Criminal Court against Netanyahu. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that doesn't really affect much. Okay, the International Criminal Court opened an investigation against Israel already a couple of years ago. It made a legal maneuver, which was really an illegal maneuver. It adopted a legal fiction that really has no basis in international law. And the legal fiction was that there is a state of Palestine capable of acceding to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. If you ask Palestinians what is their aim, right? Ask Mahmoud Abbas, what do they want? They want a state. They themselves don't think they really have a state. Okay, there's an insistence by the world, okay, for the purposes where you can bash Israel somehow for example, in the International Criminal Court, to recognize the Palestinians as a state. The court said, yeah, well, because the UN General Assembly, as you correctly said, Howard, is really a political organization, they recognize Palestine state as an observer state, okay, as an observer state. Based on that, the International Criminal Court, or at least the previous prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, said, yes, based on that, the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over the territory of the state of Palestine. What is the territory of the state of Palestine? Well, according to the court, it's Judea, Samaria, Gaza. Okay, what basis does it have for doing that? Really none, okay, because a state is a place that kind of controls its territory, conducts diplomatic relations, has a defined population. I mean, all the definitions, all the criteria that need to be met to have a state have not been met, quite obviously. I mean, nobody really believes there's a Palestinian state. There never has been, and there certainly isn't one now. Many people want there to be, but that's an ambition. It's not a fact. And yet the International Criminal Court behaves as if there's a Palestinian state. By so doing, they say they have jurisdiction over the territory of that state. and actions that, or crimes that are committed on the territory of that state. So that's been already going on for a while. It accepted jurisdiction according to the request of the Palestinians, and the date is very, very telling. 2014, just after those kids were kidnapped. If you remember, the 2014 conflict erupted after the kidnapping of some Israeli teenagers. That the date, the cutoff date, like before which the court will not have jurisdiction and from which they will have jurisdiction, was exactly after that. So that particular crime committed by the Palestinians wouldn't fall under the jurisdiction of the court. So since 2014, this discussion has been going on. The court is looking at acts committed since 2014. Again, the focus has been on Israel. They claim to be also focusing on war crimes committed by Palestinians. Here, there's an interesting interplay between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, right? In a way, the Palestinian Authority are running full steam ahead with the International Criminal Court, even though potentially, if the court did have jurisdiction, they could go after Hamas. But then you could say, Hamas has nothing to lose, right? Hamas, in any case, is a proscribed terrorist organization in most of the world, but not in South Africa.
Well, let's talk about it. The Hamas delegation arrived in South Africa yesterday. In fact, they were in Parliament today. Mm-hmm. And surely the sword cuts both ways. If the Palestinians claim to have jurisdiction in the court, they're also subject to the court, in which case Israel should be laying charges at the ICC against all leadership, political and military, of Hamas, and they should be arrested while in South Africa and elsewhere.
Absolutely. The thing is, Israel is not going to lay those charges because Israel doesn't recognize the jurisdiction of the court. But I think any country that sympathizes with Israel and agrees that Hamas is guilty of war crimes should certainly be first in the queue to accuse Hamas. And yes, these are open and shut war crimes. I don't think there's any question about that Hamas committed war crimes. And if South Africa was a faithful member of the International Criminal Court, they would consider arresting the members of Hamas. But of course, there was Omar al-Bashir who also made a visit to South Africa.
And we wanted to, not only did we spirit him out of the country, we wanted to leave the International Criminal Court as a result. And then when we invited Vladimir Putin here, we tried to leave the court again because we didn't want to arrest him if he came to South Africa. We have a very dubious relationship with the ICC in South Africa, but it's not necessarily a problem, because we have a very dubious relationship with the truth and our international alliances generally, whether it's Russia or Cuba or Venezuela or Iran. Our closest allies are the worst human rights abusers in the world in South Africa. So we shouldn't be surprised there's any of this. And we mistakenly believe that somehow a government as corrupt as our own should be consistent in its relationship with the rest of the world.
Well, I think it's very unfortunate, Howard, what you described, because maybe I'm being a bit idealistic. I am an idealistic person. I made Aliyah, I came to Israel, so I am an idealistic person. But I always thought that South Africa, with its experience, and its wonderful example of how peoples can, with all the problems, without denying the problems, but how sort of different peoples can actually, at the end of the day, sort of make peace and get on with each other. There could have been a shining light, okay. And being able to share of that experience, and perhaps especially in the Middle East, where there's such a critical need for that. But South Africa has really written itself out of the story by being so blatantly down on one side, and not just on one side. We're not talking about just supporting the Palestinians, right? Supporting Hamas is really off the table. Okay, remember that the Palestinian Authority are arch enemies of Hamas. Okay, most of the Arab world regards Hamas as an enemy. So South Africa is really, really going to the very extreme of the field, okay, by embracing Hamas. It really doesn't make sense to me in terms of what South Africa, my understanding of what South Africa wants its place to be in the world. But that's for you guys to sort out.
Well, we probably have time for just one or two last questions from members of the audience. So if you do have a question, please ask that question now. As we speak about Hamas not only just being closely aligned to the African National Congress in South Africa, having been to South Africa and being guests of the ANC on a number of occasions, but also a Hamas office in Cape Town. And it was very interesting today to see the spokesperson of the cabinet, the minister of the presidency today say, well, we're not aware of a Hamas office in Cape Town. All she had to do was go onto Google and the photographs are there and the address is there. And she wasn't aware of the Hamas delegation in South Africa, despite the fact that today they were in parliament a few meters away from her office. We seem to be very ignorant of what's happening in the world around us. And it did, let us not forget, take 9 days for our president to even mention the 7th of October massacre. 9 days. And on day number 8, he put on a kafir, as did the entire cabinet, and expressed undying support for the Palestinian cause, after having just had 1,200 Israelis massacred in one of the worst human rights abuses of the modern era. And that's the side we choose on. And that's our challenge that we have as South African Jews, our moral obligation to oust the ANC from power and replace it with a far better government than the one we currently have. Hilda says she's seen the Hamas offices, which are above Buitengracht Street in Burkaap. Terry Rendell says, I must come home. Terry, I am home. I have multiple homes, and I am determined to get this home right as well. Dave, there have been no questions that have come in, additional questions, so it would appear that you've answered all of these remarkable, difficult, complex legal issues for us. The one amazing thing, and I just want to comment, is the world called for corridors for people to leave northern Gaza to escape the conflict, and the moment they did, I saw Israel was accused of ethnically cleansing people by allowing them to escape the conflict zone. So the level of hypocrisy is just unbelievable. I see Joanne saying, thank you, Mr. Benjamin. I now understand the distinction of law between human rights and the law of humanity and some of the differences and why war crimes committed, etc. Much appreciated. But Dave, the last word is to you. Give us your hopes, your dreams, and tell us about a better future in the years ahead.
Well, actually, I think if there was a generally wider, greater awareness worldwide of what the law actually says, of what international law actually says, rather than what people think or assume, we'd be a lot better off. I have to say, my experience as a lawyer, right, in countries around the world, is that certainly people in the militaries of countries and people in the government, or the people who deal with security, people who actually have responsibility for security, they do understand, they do get it. This may sound strange. I think Colonel Kemp could have confirmed this, but after each Israeli military operation in Gaza, foreign militaries literally stand in line to study the Israeli methods of operation. Okay. They regard the Israelis as being somehow really in the front lines of the ability to conduct complex military operations against these sort of non-state asymmetric actors, and doing so in a way which is effective in the sense of being able to destroy military targets and drastically reducing what we call the collateral damage, the damage to civilians and civilian objects. So as bad as the statistics may sound, remember, because the statistics you're getting from Hamas, the actual numbers of casualties, etc., will come out much later. Okay, after Israel and others have managed to research exactly. What you're not also getting is the breakdown between combatants who've been killed and civilians who've been killed, which obviously is a very important distinction too. I can say, just as a matter of fact, if you compare the Israeli military and how it operates and the statistics in relation to its operation compared to similar theaters of war in other places, you'll see that the ratio of combatants to non-combatants who have been killed, who are casualties of war, is actually very low, okay, relatively. Again, it's a terrible tragedy, okay, and every person with humanity and every person with a conscience is going to be deeply, deeply troubled by any civilian casualty, by any innocent person being killed. But again, it's war, it's different. You have to look through different glasses. You have to take that leap into this different world, this ugly world. It's out there, okay, and it works by different standards, different laws, different things that are generally illegal become legal. If people are willing to do that, okay, without bias, without taking sides in the conflict, without sort of saying, okay, just because one side is the underdog, they need to get a free pass on these things. Okay, if it's objective, strong doesn't always mean wrong. Okay, that's an important principle to remember. So I think if just people be more objective or educate themselves about what the law actually says, about look at what Israel, the way Israel actually operates, things which actually are quite clear, even though there's a lot of destruction in Gaza, if you see the way it is, you can see that it's targeted, you can see that it's in specific places, it's not just arbitrary, it's not indiscriminate. Israel has been consistent. Don't be confused by the bluster of some of our leaders. Okay, just look on the ground, and I think you'll see that actually Israel can both defeat Hamas and abide by international law at the same time. That's my firm belief. As long as political pressure and diplomatic pressure won't be brought to bear to prevent us from doing so.
Amazing. David Benjamin, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And if Colonel Kemp is watching us still as well, a huge thank you. We've had two great intellects and two experts, literally international experts in their field, speaking to us this evening. It's been such an honor and such a privilege to be able to speak to you both. And of course, the thousands and thousands of people who've watched us this evening on Zoom, on YouTube, on Facebook. It's just such an absolute privilege to be able to provide this platform and to allow an honest and open conversation where we cut away all of the nonsense and the propaganda and we deal with the real issues that the world faces at the moment. With that, we're going to say good night to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you again, hopefully maybe one last time before we take a Hanukkah and festive break at the end of this year. Thank you for joining us. We're going to leave the chat on for a few minutes so you can leave a comment for all of us. Good night. Thanks, David. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
To who?